Hey guys, it's Dr. D. Hope you guys are well. Welcome back. Today I want to talk a little bit about a new topic. We've been talking about market structure for a little while, and today we're going to introduce a new one called oligopoly. Okay. Now, an oligopoly is an industry with only a few firms. Now, this is different than the other two extremes which we've already considered. And that difference is, it turns out, in terms of our analysis, is going to be really large, right? So far, what we've looked at was cases of competition, right? Competition, there we go. Sorry, let me write that better. Competition. And there were two types, right? We had perfect competition, where we had undifferentiated goods. They're all identical. And we also had monopolistic competition, where each firm is differentiating its products. But both of these have the same effect in some sense, in the sense that when a firm is trying to think about what it should respond to, it doesn't make sense to pay attention to any other firms, because there are many firms, none of which is particularly significant. And so for the market, for the firm, what it pays attention to is it pays attention to demand. There is a well-defined demand curve, right? In particular, D sub I, its own demand curve. The firm is paying attention to its own demand curve, and these differed, right? For perfect competition, we had demand curves that looked like this. That's the individual firm demand for a perfectly competitive firm. For monopolistic competitors, it looks like quite a bit different. Here, let me label my axes before I feel like I should take points off of my own work. For a monopolistic competitor, the demand curve looks like this, D sub I, right? It's downward sloping, so if they reduce or increase their price, their quantity does not change infinitely the way that it does up here with the perfectly competitive firm. But in any case, firms are not paying attention to other firms. They're only paying attention to the prices that they face, right? We looked at another case. We looked at the case of monopoly, where we have one firm. And that looks a lot like this one. Where the firm faces, but instead of DI, just scribble that out. It's just the market demand curve, right? Because there's only one firm, so that firm supplies the whole market. And again, there's no other firms to pay attention to, so they pay attention to demand. For an oligopolist, the situation is quite a bit different, right? Because it's similar to monopolist or monopolistic competitor in that it can change its prices and it won't lose the whole market, because they're, or might not, depending on the model you prefer. But their interactions are much more complex. When we have an oligopoly, which has a few firms, not many firms, a few firms, then what we can say is, if I change my price, my oligopolistic competitor will respond. And if it is the case, for example, that we have a duopoly, that means that there are only two firms. Now, we might both have half the market. It might be the case that I have 25% of the market and the other competitor has 70% of the market, and then the rest of the market comes from other smaller places. But if that's the case, that fundamentally changes the structure of this. In particular, what it means is that the relationship between P and quantity demanded for a given firm, right? This relationship, which we've called demand, right? This is strategically interdependent, which is to say that there's no well-defined and well-behaved demand curve. So we're not going to be able to get a demand curve, right? It's unclear. We don't know how other firms will respond. If there is no demand curve, right? No demand curve, that means there's no marginal revenue curve. which means we can't do what we've been doing the whole time. We can't choose Q star where MC equals marginal revenue, right? Because we don't have a marginal revenue curve, because we don't know what the other person's going to do, right? That they're going to respond, and maybe they'll respond in a predictable way, maybe they'll respond in an unpredictable way. I don't know how much information they have or what their timing is like, but their actions are going to have significant consequences that I need to take into account, and that I can't just let go if I want to understand what's really going on. So what do? I say we throw up our hands and call it a day and go home. Well, you can do that, but you wouldn't stay in business for very long, and so what we would like to do is to analyze strategic interactions. That's what we're going to do. These strategic interactions, which are very different and very interesting and very complicated. They depend very much on the amount of power each firm has. They depend on timing in our model. And in fact, there's a whole field devoted to this called game theory. And so that's where we're going to go. We're going to start looking at game theory. Game theory analyzes, the way that we can observe behavior and predict behavior when these strategic interactions happen. When player 1 affects player 2, and then player 2's decision affects player 1, and vice versa. And we can kind of do some inference to try to draw some reasonable conclusions. So that's what we're going to do. So where before we've been using supply and demand, right? Or in the case of monopoly and monopolistic competitors, just demand, because we didn't have a supply curve, but marginal cost and demand. Now we're going to have to learn some brand new tools, and they're going to be some fun tools. We're really just going to scratch the surface of game theory, but we're gonna do some fun stuff with it. So that's where we are, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.